Hello and welcome to the Ocean News Podcast, an audio series taking you through the breaking news and the biggest stories from the Oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, news editor here at Oceanographic magazine, and in this episode I'll be taking a deeper dive into the headline on everyone's lips in the newsroom this week, that scientists have now linked an historic spike in the deaths of Florida's bottlenose dolphin with a phytoplankton bloom in the Indian River Lagoon. Yes, in this special episode, I'll be talking to the lead author behind the study, Charles Chuck Jacoby, as we learn more about this fascinating story of investigative and forensic marine biology. Let's give ourselves a little of the story for context. It was a little over a decade ago that scientists monitoring the Indian River Lagoon, a 156-mile-long shallow water estuary along Florida's east coast, noticed that the local dolphin population was struggling. Of the some 337 individual dolphins observed over a period, 64% of them were underweight, 5% of them were malnourished to emaciation, and 77 of them died. It was classified at the time as an unusual mortality event that took out 8% of Florida's bottlenose dolphin population. 12 years on from the event, and this week, researchers from the Florida Flood Hub for Applied Research and Innovation believe they have uncovered the root cause of the issue. And it's all to do with a major bloom in phytoplankton, which took place 2 years prior, back in 2011. But what links a sudden explosion in the prevalence of phytoplankton with the severe malnourishment of Florida's bottlenose dolphin? The answer has been published this week in Frontiers in Marine Science, in which analysis of historic evidence has linked this bloom to the loss of key habitats in the Indian River Lagoon, and therefore forced changes in the type of food available to its resident dolphins. This week, we talk to lead author behind the study, Dr. Charles Chuck Jacoby, now with the Florida Flood Hub for Applied Research and Innovation, to better understand the details surrounding this fascinating tale of who done it and the learnings we can all take to avoid it happening again. So, Chuck, to take it from the very top then of this incredibly interesting study, would you like to talk us through the findings and the outcomes of this really quite fascinating investigation into just what caused this spike in dolphin deaths 10 years ago?
The outcome, or as it were, or the findings was our ability to link the mortality that we saw in dolphins back through the ecological system to some changes that started a few years earlier. And those changes involved fairly extensive, intensive, and long-lasting blooms of single-celled algae or phytoplankton, which shaded the seagrasses, which are plants that have roots and grow in the bottom, and as well as some of the larger algae that in the lagoon where this occurred, there's what we call drift algae. They just roll around loose. They're not attached. Both of those things are habitats for animals that provide shelter, so hiding from things that would want to eat you, and they provide food. And so we saw this one bloom and then a series of blooms, and the habitats decreased in their extent and in their quality. And then we were able to sort of say, okay, let's look at what happens to some of the other parts of the ecology, like the fish assemblages. And so the data showed that fish assemblages responded in a variety of ways, but several species sort of decreased in numbers. There might have been some distributional changes. Animals may have moved further inshore because they didn't have the habitat offshore. So we had these changes, and then there was an unusual mortality event, which is a sort of a spike, as it were, in the mortality of animals like dolphins. And that occurred in 2013. And fortunately, people have been collecting samples, mussel samples in particular, from the dolphins that were stranded. And then other folks have been working on samples of fish, potential prey, that were collected as part of what we call a fisheries independent monitoring effort. So when they survey the fishes, in a way that doesn't involve fishermen, as it were, right? So that it's a kind of a independent look at how fish populations are doing. And so when we looked at the isotopic ratios, carbon and nitrogen have multiple stable isotopes. And you can track what things are eating by looking at the mixing of these isotopes. Just like think of a tap where you put warm water and cold water, or hot water and cold water together to get warm water, same sort of thing. And the dolphins showed a shift in their diets. And that shift in the diets took them towards eating or catching more of a prey item that had less energy content the dolphins would use to get energy. So it meant they had to eat about 15% more prey. And it looks as if they weren't able to do that in many cases. So that's where the stranded dolphins come in, because almost all those stranded dolphins were malnourished. They were either, emaciated or, almost all the way to starving.
Well, I guess what's really interesting about this story, or the positive that can be taken from this, is that you really were able to piece together, albeit retrospectively, piece together just what had been happening to these dolphins and what was driving that malnourishment. Because the evidence, you sort of pieced it together; it was there for you.
This is one of the few unusual mortality events where the cause appeared pretty obvious. And what we were able to do is kind of link all these pieces together, which, have been collected, and then by connecting those dots, get a kind of a picture.
So I think another thing that really struck me was the way that you traced all of that back, and it came all the way back to the human activity that was at the root cause of this. Like, this was the influx of the nutrients, namely, as the study says, nitrogen, phosphorus, that was entering the lagoon through what humans were doing, that human impact on the environment.
Yeah, for the lagoon, there are not a lot of what typically are called point sources, factories or big sewage treatment plants that are discharging into the lagoon. That was all kind of dealt with back in the 90s. But there's what folks refer to as the non-point source pollution. So rainfall kind of driven, stormwater, brings, like you say, fertilizer in. There are a lot of septic systems around the lagoon, and that can get into the water table and flow into the lagoon. In the late 90s, there was a recognition that the lagoon was probably under stress, and that spurred this whole process of trying to determine what are the loads of nutrients, what might be the safe loads of nutrients, how would you actually show that, and then making a plan where the stakeholders took on allocations, as they call them, to reduce their loads of nutrients so that we get to this, what was considered the safe target. Now, all that everyone understood were estimates, and so there was uncertainty around all of that. So the whole process is adaptive. So they track the lagoon's response to the reductions, and if they need to do more, they'll do more. But the current effort runs through 2035. One of the sort of flow on the outcomes, as it were, the impact of what this particular effort with the dolphins might have, is to convince people that all that investment in trying to reduce those loads does have a payoff. And that's kind of what I think everybody hopes will happen, is that people will say, okay, now I get why this is important. Not always obvious, straight up obvious why you would bother to invest millions of dollars, to control loads of nutrients.
Yeah, but when it has such like a visceral impact as it has, as you guys have proven it to have, then I guess that resonates all the harder, right?
Yes, I think, again, that my parts of my former team, that worked on the seagrasses and things, I always sort of lamented the fact that the charismatic megafauna, as we would call them, would take center stage, the dolphins and manatees and things like that. But again, if that convinces people of the value of making these investments, then it's worthwhile.
It's so fascinating. So if we look at factors that have historically contributed to this influx in nutrients entering the lagoon through storm flows and heavy rains, is there an argument that the findings of this study are only going to become more important to take notice of as we enter a period of more extreme weather events through things like climate change?
Well, again, I think as weather patterns tend to become more extreme,
Mm.
which seems to be what people think will mostly happen. Yes, it will become important to recognize that in the way we manage things. So, for example, for the lagoon, in 2011, there was an unusual bloom, much larger than had been seen in the past, and it lasted longer. Since then, there were others that actually were more intense and lasted even longer. But that first event, people viewed it as kind of a tipping point. That the system had been stressed to the point where it didn't have the resilience to cope with a couple of weather events. So we had cold winters and warm summers, a pair of each, in succession. And that seemed to be what caused some changes in the way the lagoon operates, that led to the bloom. So it kind of ended up with more nutrients being available for the phytoplankton. And that cycle is something that a lot of systems see happen. Once the phytoplankton get hold of the nutrients, they tend to reduce the competition by shading out other things that try to photosynthesize and use those nutrients. So you get kind of a vicious downward spiral, as it were. It's that event thing that wasn't explicitly, I guess you'd call it, factored into the way a management was approached. And it's those kinds of events that we might need to think about a little more as weather patterns get a little more extreme.
You mentioned that there have been phytoplankton bloom events like this before. Have any of these events in the past been linked like this to an unusual mortality event of marine mammals, or is this study relating to the dolphins back in 2013 more unique in that sense?
In that package of papers we're putting together, there's a link to an unusual mortality event for manatees. And so manatees switched food from seagrasses, which became relatively scarce, to drift algae, which recovered a little faster because it doesn't tend to need as much light as the seagrass. And apparently, um, in the guts of some of the manatees, there was a bacterial response where there was a bacteria that was stimulated that produced toxins. And so the manatees died from like a toxic shock syndrome almost. It wasn't that they were emaciated or in some other way stressed, but they just couldn't cope with the change in diets, as it were. Around 2020 and 2021, there was a manatee unusual mortality event where the manatees were emaciated, so parallel to the dolphin one. Haven't pulled all those pieces together, but obviously the seagrasses are just now beginning to recover. So the lagoon has had 2-3 years of relatively clear water, and seagrasses are making a bit of a comeback.
So are these findings that can sort of be lessons can be learnt from this and sort of translated across different marine habitats, or are these very specific to the lagoon?
No, I think there are broader lessons here. Once again, dolphins have been treated as what are called sentinel species in lots of places because they're large, relatively long-lived. They need a lot of food to sort of keep their metabolism going at the rate that it needs to. And they feed moderately broadly across, a range of prey items. So any sort of shift in the trophic dynamics, the who eats what or who's available to be eaten, can affect dolphins because they're kind of at the peak of that pyramid, as it were, And so if the base moves, then the dolphins may have an issue. So, again, the fact that this could be linked together should be something that other people can look at. Oh, well, we may be able to do that here as well.
Well, Chuck, thank you for sharing your insight on this very interesting topic. And although I know congratulations may be the wrong term to use here, congratulations on making those findings and making that headway and hopefully delivering the positive steps that can stop such an event like this happening to the dolphins and indeed the manatees of the Florida Indian River Lagoon in the future. So there you have it, a fascinating piece of investigative marine biology with the potential to influence action for years to come. If you'd like to learn more about this story or other stories to do with life in Florida's Indian River Lagoon, head to the Oceanographic Newsroom. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins. Thank you for listening.